What happens when a cunning journalist thinks he's got the upper hand, only to watch his plan unravel in front of millions? That's exactly what went down when J.D. Vance, the freshly sworn-in vice president, stepped into a TV studio ready to face a storm. This isn't just a story about a political showdown. It's a roller coaster of twists, raw emotion, and a man standing tall against a tidal wave of scrutiny. Curious where this is headed? Stick around, because it's about to get wild. Oh, and drop a comment below. Where are you tuning in from today? The scene kicked off on February 28, 2026, under the blazing lights of one of America's biggest talk shows. J.D. Vance walked onto the set, his calm demeanor hiding the sharpness of a Marine ready for battle. He'd just taken his oath of office, and the energy in the room buzzed with excitement. Across from him sat Daniel Carter, the host with a reputation for cutting words and a clear lean toward liberal views. Daniel had spent weeks plotting this moment, his team promising a fair chat about the new administration. But the smirk on his face told a different story. He was out for blood. As J.D. settled into his chair, the air felt thick. The usual small talk before the cameras rolled was quick and forced. Daniel's smile didn't match the cold glint in his eyes, and the crew seemed on edge, like they knew something big was brewing. J.D., trained to read a room from his time in the Marines, picked up on it instantly. Every gut feeling screamed this wasn't going to be a friendly chat. Daniel clutched his note cards tightly, his knuckles pale, and launched in with a sugary tone that didn't fool anyone. "Mr. Vice President," Daniel started, his voice dripping with fake warmth, "your journey's been quite a ride, from slamming President Trump to standing by his side as his right-hand man. How do you explain that?" J.D. flashed a steady grin, his eyes sharp with the kind of wisdom earned through tough years. "Daniel, that's a great question to kick things off," he said smoothly. "It's not just about me, it's about what America's all about, growing, learning, and seeing things differently when the facts change." The crowd perked up, caught off guard by J.D.'s cool-headed reply. No dodging, no excuses, just straight talk. Daniel shifted in his seat, thrown off by the response. His next jab was ready, but it didn't land quite right anymore. "Growing and learning," he sneered, his tone sharp. "Some folks might call that flipping sides for a better gig." J.D. didn't flinch. "Here's the thing, Daniel," he said, his voice even. "In this country, we value rethinking things when new info comes up. Back when I criticized Trump, I saw the world one way. Then I saw something else, his work lifting up the people I wrote about, the ones who'd been left behind." For a split second, Daniel's face stiffened. J.D. kept going, locking eyes with him. "Let me ask you this, Daniel. Have you ever looked at something again and thought, maybe I got that wrong?" The question hung in the air, and Daniel froze for a beat too long. "We're here to talk about your shifts, not mine," he snapped, flipping through his cards like he couldn't wait to swing again. But J.D.'s calm was unshakable, and the audience was already hooked. They could feel it. This wasn't just an interview. It was a showdown of wills. Daniel regrouped, leaning into his next attack. "Let's switch gears," he said, his voice tight. "Your speech at the National Prayer Breakfast last week, you talked about faith guiding government. Isn't that a risky line to cross in a country like ours?" The room went quiet, the crowd sensing a big moment. Daniel thought he'd cornered J.D., but the spark in J.D.'s eyes said he'd been ready for this one all along. J.D. leaned forward, his tone firm but warm. "Daniel, what I said was our founders knew leaders need a moral compass. They didn't fear faith, they feared unchecked power." A few amens rippled through the audience. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he pushed back. "Come on, in today's world, with all our differences," J.D. raised a hand, polite but steady. "Let me finish, because this matters. When I swore my oath, I put my hand on the Bible, just like leaders have for centuries. Not to push a religion, but to honor where our rights come from, something bigger than just laws." The crowd murmured, some nodding along. Daniel shot a quick glance at his producer, who was watching like a hawk from offstage. J.D. added, "You know what's funny, Daniel? When I was a Marine, no one batted an eye at our chaplain being there." The words landed like a quiet bomb, pulling the audience deeper into the clash. This wasn't just about politics anymore. It was personal, and everyone could feel the stakes rising. The tension in the studio was electric, and J.D. Vance wasn't backing down. Daniel Carter, the host with a knack for stirring trouble, thought he'd thrown a curveball with that faith in government question. But J.D. turned it right back on him, and now the crowd was buzzing. People leaned forward in their seats, eyes glued to the stage. This wasn't just a chat anymore, it was a battle of ideas, and J.D. was playing to win. Could Daniel claw his way back, or was he about to lose the reins completely? Daniel's face twitched as he tried to pivot. "Let's shift gears," he said, his voice sharp with a hint of nerves. "You've said some bold things lately, like calling President Trump God's tool for fixing America. Don't you think that's a little over the top?" He smirked, expecting J.D. to squirm. But J.D. just sat there, cool as ever, like he'd seen this pitch coming from a mile away. "Over the top?" J.D. replied, his tone steady. "What's wild to me is how some folks in the media freak out when a leader mentions faith, but stay quiet when families are struggling because of bad policies." The room went still. J.D. paused, letting his words sink in, then kept going. "You brought up Trump, so let's talk facts, not headlines. Look at what's happening out there, communities picking up steam since we took office. That's what matters." The audience hung on every word, and Daniel's usual quick comeback stalled. His plan to rattle J.D. was crumbling, and he didn't like it one bit. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he shuffled his notes, desperate to regain control. "Fine, let's dig into your story then," Daniel snapped, his voice tight. "You've built this whole image as a guy from humble roots. But now you're up there in D.C., rubbing elbows with the big shots. Haven't you left that old life behind?" It was a low blow, and a few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Daniel thought he'd struck gold, but J.D.'s face didn't budge. A tiny smile crept up instead, like he'd been waiting for this one too. "Daniel, that's a funny take," J.D. said, his voice warm but firm. "Where I'm from, we don't judge a guy by his address or his job. We look at his heart. I learned that from my grandma in Middletown, Ohio, and it stuck with me no matter where I go." The crowd murmured, some nodding like they knew exactly what he meant. Daniel's eyes narrowed, sensing the mood slipping away. "So you're saying none of this fancy suits, big titles changed you?" He pressed, his tone biting. "We're supposed to buy that your flip on Trump wasn't just a power grab." J.D. leaned in slightly, his gaze locked on Daniel. "You want to talk flips? Here's what takes guts. Owning up when you're wrong, even when folks like you try to spin it. I wrote what I felt about Trump back then, sure. But then I saw the man in action, not just the media version. That's what shifted me." A ripple of agreement rolled through the audience. Daniel tugged at his tie, his cool slipping fast. "Oh, come on," he shot back. "You went from trashing him to being his cheerleader. Some might call that selling out." That jab hit the air hard, and a few gasps broke the silence. Daniel thought he'd landed a knockout, but J.D. wasn't fazed. "Selling out," J.D. said, his voice cutting through like a blade. "You know what sells out, Daniel? Twisting someone's story to fit your angle. Where I come from, in the Marines, out in the real world, you judge a person by what they do, not what the news cooks up. I've seen Trump's heart up close, not the cartoon version you push." The crowd erupted, applause crashing through the studio. Daniel tried to jump in, but J.D. wasn't done. "You think loyalty's a joke because it doesn't fit your playbook," J.D. said, his tone firm but calm. "But I learned something in combat. When you find someone worth standing by, you don't waver. I'm proud to back President Trump, and that's not a headline, it's a choice." The cheers grew louder, and Daniel's smirk faded. He glanced at his producer, who was pacing off stage, clearly rattled. This wasn't the trap he'd set, it was turning into J.D.'s moment, and the audience was eating it up. Daniel tried one more swing. "A smart guy like you, with all that Yale polish, don't you see the mess in backing someone you used to call out?" His voice had an edge of sarcasm now, but J.D. just smiled. "There you go, Daniel, hunting for cracks that aren't there. The real mess is pretending I didn't see what I saw, Trump stepping up for people like the ones I grew up with. That's not a contradiction. That's waking up." The applause roared again, and Daniel's hands fumbled with his cards. He was losing the room, and he knew it. Daniel Carter was scrambling. The studio lights felt hotter now, and J.D. Vance's steady answers were turning the tables faster than Daniel could handle. The audience was all in, clapping and nodding, while Daniel's carefully laid trap was falling apart. He'd come in thinking he'd make J.D. sweat, but instead, he was the one wiping his brow. Could he pull this interview back from the edge, or was J.D. about to take it to a whole new level? The crowd was on pins and needles, and the energy in the room said this was far from over. Daniel flipped through his notes, his voice sharp with a mix of frustration and defiance. "Let's get real, Mr. Vice President," he said, trying to sound in charge. "You've spent years playing the voice of the little guy card. But now you're up there defending a billionaire, Trump. Isn't that a slap in the face to the folks you claim to stand for?" The question landed heavy, and a few people in the crowd held their breath. Daniel leaned back, thinking he'd finally cracked JD's armor. But JD just tilted his head, a flicker of a grin showing he wasn't rattled. "Real talk, Daniel?" JD said, his voice smooth but solid. "I see a guy who thinks a nice suit wipes out where I came from. My grandma in Middletown, Ohio, she didn't care about fancy clothes or big titles. She taught me values stick with you, no matter where life takes you." The audience stirred, some letting out quiet yes of agreement. Daniel's smirk faltered. "So, you're saying none of this power stuff's gone to your head?" He pushed, his tone snarky. "That we should just ignore how you flipped on Trump?" JD leaned forward, his eyes steady. "You keep circling back to that, don't you? Here's the deal. Real strength is admitting when you misjudge something. I had my doubts about Trump once, sure. But then I saw him fight for the people I grew up with, the ones who'd been forgotten. That's not flipping, it's growing up." The crowd broke into cheers, and Daniel's face tightened. He tried to cut in, but JD held the floor. "Call it what you want, Daniel. I call it seeing the truth and sticking to it, even when guys like you try to twist it." Daniel's chair creaked as he shifted, his cool slipping further. "Truth," he scoffed, his voice rising. "You're sitting there in a slick suit, backing a guy you used to trash. People see right through that." A hush fell over the studio, the jab hanging in the air. JD didn't blink. "Here's what I see," he said, his tone calm but razor-sharp. "You think loyalty's a punchline because it doesn't fit your story. I learned a different lesson in the Marines. When you find someone who's got your back, you stand by them. Trump's shown me who he is, not the version you spin on air." The applause hit like a wave, drowning out Daniel's next move. He glanced at his producer, who was gesturing wildly from the sidelines, but JD wasn't letting up. "You want to talk suits?" JD added, a playful edge to his voice. "They don't change what's inside. I'm still the kid from Ohio who knows what it's like to scrape by. That's why I'm here, because Trump gets it too." The crowd roared again, and Daniel's hands shook slightly as he gripped his cards. He was losing ground fast, and the room could feel it. "Okay, let's try this," Daniel said, his voice edgy now. "You're a smart guy, Yale Law, big brain. How do you square that with cheering for Trump after all you said before?" He thought he'd found a weak spot, but JD's smile widened just a touch. "Daniel, you're so hung up on digging up dirt, you're missing what's right in front of you," JD replied. "I went to Yale, sure, but I didn't leave my roots behind. I saw Trump do right by regular folks, people like my neighbors. That's not a puzzle, it's just common sense." The cheers erupted again, louder this time, and Daniel's jaw clenched. He shot back. "Common sense? Last month, I did a whole piece on how your faith looks like a shiny new prop for votes." His words were sharp, but JD didn't flinch. "A prop," JD said, leaning in. "I've been going to the same church since before I ever ran for anything. You want to call that fake? Go ask my grandma. She'd set you straight about who taught me to pray, even when we barely had food on the table." A woman in the front row nodded hard, like she felt every word. Daniel's face went red. "I was just saying the timing's convenient," he stammered, but JD cut in smooth as butter. "Timing? My faith's been with me my whole life, Daniel. You can poke at my choices all you want, but when you drag that into it, you're not just coming at me, you're taking a swing at every American who believes in something bigger." The audience lit up, clapping and shouting, and Daniel's plan was officially in shambles. He fumbled with his notes, searching for a lifeline, but J.D. had the room in his hands now, and he wasn't letting go. Daniel Carter was on the ropes, and the studio crackled with energy. J.D. Vance had flipped the script, turning every jab into a chance to shine. The audience was electric, clapping, cheering, fully in J.D.'s corner. Daniel's big plan to trip him up was backfiring hard, and now he was grasping at straws. Could he land one last hit, or was J.D. about to seal the deal with a knockout moment? The room buzzed, waiting for the next move. Daniel adjusted his tie, his voice shaky but stubborn. "All right, let's talk about something you said last month," he pressed. "You called folks who love old-school values stuck in the past. Doesn't that slam millions of Americans who live that way?" He thought he'd found a crack, but J.D.'s eyes lit up. He was ready. "Nice try, Daniel," J.D. said, his tone steady and warm. "What I actually said was the opposite. You twisted it. I'm talking about the people who go to church, raise families, love this country. They're not behind. They're the backbone of America." The crowd erupted, some shouting, "That's right." Daniel's face froze, his notes slipping in his hands. "I didn't twist anything," he shot back, but his voice wavered. J.D. didn't let up. "Oh, you did," he said, calm but firm. "You spent a whole show last week calling my hometown Trumpville like it's a punchline. That's not journalism. That's looking down on people." The audience gasped, then cheered louder. Daniel's producer waved from the sidelines, looking antsy, but J.D. kept rolling. "Here's the thing that gets you, Daniel," J.D. said, leaning in. "You can't stand that a guy like me, small-town roots, Yale degree, can hold on to faith and still back Trump. It messes with your whole game." The room went wild, applause shaking the walls. Daniel tried to cut in. "That's not..." J.D. raised a hand, polite but sharp. "No, let me finish. You invited me here to poke at my beliefs, my past, my loyalty. But what's really eating you is that I don't fit your box, and neither do millions of Americans." Daniel's cheeks flushed. "You're dodging," he stammered. "Same old trick, flip it back on me." J.D. smiled, unshaken. "No trick, Daniel. Just a question. Have you ever met someone and realized you got them wrong? I did with Trump. I saw the real guy, not your TV version, and I chose to stand with him." An older man in the crowd yelled, "Preach it," and the cheers swelled again. Daniel was sinking, and the studio felt it. "You're sweating this because I think for myself," J.D. added, his voice ringing clear. "That scares you, someone who won't bend to your spin." Daniel opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. The audience was on its feet now, and J.D. had turned the interview into something bigger, a stand for everyone watching who'd ever felt dismissed. Daniel checked his watch, desperate for an out. But J.D.'s next move was already in motion, and it was going to hit hard. The studio was a live wire, and J.D. Vance was in full command. Daniel Carter's ambush had blown up in his face, and the crowd was on its feet, roaring for J.D. Every word he'd tossed at Daniel came back stronger, and now the host was a mess, fumbling, flushed, out of moves. Was this the moment J.D. would finish it off and leave the audience with something unforgettable? The air hummed with anticipation, and J.D. was ready to bring it home. "I'm not twisting anything," Daniel sputtered, his voice thin. J.D. cut in, calm as steel. "No, Daniel, I'm just showing you what's real. You came here to make me look small, but all you've done is show your own blind spots." The crowd cheered, a tidal wave of sound. J.D. turned to them, his face steady but alive. "This isn't about me or one bad interview. It's about all of you out there, people who've been laughed at for what they believe, for who they back, for loving this country." Daniel slumped in his chair, his producer slashing a hand to signal the end. But J.D. wasn't done. "When I met Trump," he said, his voice strong, "I had a call to make, stick to old ideas or see the guy for real. I picked truth over ego, and I'd do it again." The applause thundered, shaking the room. "Americans are fed up," J.D. went on. "Fed up with being judged for praying, for holding tight to family, for wanting a country that works for them, not just the loudmouths on TV." The audience leapt up, clapping so hard it drowned Daniel's weak. "We're out of time." J.D. stood, smoothing his jacket, and faced the camera square. To everyone watching, he said, his tone earnest, "What you saw today? It's not just some TV spat. It's about standing tall when they try to knock you down. They thought I'd back off my faith, my support for Trump, my roots. But that's not who I am, and it's not who we are." He paused, letting it sink in, then hit the final note. If you've ever been told your values don't count, that you're out of step, don't buy it. Strength isn't bowing to the crowd. It's knowing what's true and sticking to it. The studio shook with a standing ovation, even some crew joining in. J.D. walked off, head high, while Daniel stared blankly, his big moment in ruins. It wasn't just a win. It was a lesson in guts and grit, handed out live for all to see. This clash showed one thing loud and clear. When someone's got real heart, no slick host can dim it. J.D. Vance didn't just dodge the hits. He turned them into a rallying cry. Loved this story about standing up and speaking out? Hit that like button and subscribe for more. And hey, drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and what's one value you'd never back down on? Let's keep this going because faith, family, and freedom, they're what make America strong. God bless you all, and God bless this country.